Welcome to Washington Today for Monday, December 12th, 2022. I'm Gary Sterikoff. Thanks a lot for joining us today. Here are some headlines. Congress is back today, and lawmakers are facing a deadline to keep the government operating through next year to avert a shutdown. Current funding runs out this Friday at midnight. And according to TheHill.com, negotiators are trading top-line numbers on a possible deal. We'll hear about what's going on behind the scenes with Punchbowl News congressional reporter Max Cohen, along with comments from Senators Schumer and McConnell and top House Republican Kevin McCarthy coming up. The January 6th committee's final report is expected to come out next Wednesday, and according to Politico, it will start with an extensive executive summary describing former President Trump's role in the attempt to subvert the 2020 election. Drafts of the report have been circulating among committee members for weeks. It includes thousands of footnotes drawn from the panel's interviews and research over the past 16 months. The final report will have 8 chapters that follow the evidence the panel unveiled during its public hearings in June and July. Ukraine's prime minister made another appeal today for American-made Patriot missiles and other high-tech air defense systems to help in its battle against the Russian invasion. Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal told French broadcaster LCI that Russia's continued attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure is an attempt to flood Europe with Ukrainian refugees. On Tuesday, more than 45 nations and 20 international institutions are scheduled to hold a conference in Paris that will coordinate aid for Ukraine's water, power, food, health, and transportation needs. Pentagon Press Secretary Brigadier General Pat Ryder has told reporters that there are no plans to send Patriot missiles to Ukraine. The Supreme Court has agreed to hear a second case challenging the legality of the Biden administration's student loan relief program. The case, originally filed in Texas, claims the administration improperly implemented the plan without proper public notification or input. It joins another suit the court said it would hear that involves a challenge brought by 6 states that claims the president exceeded his authority in announcing the plan. We begin on Capitol Hill, where lawmakers are facing a deadline to keep the government operating through next year and avoid a shutdown. Current funding runs out this Friday at midnight, and according to TheHill.com, negotiators are trading top-line numbers on a possible deal, and the two sides are roughly $26 billion apart. With more, here's Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer during his Leader Time remarks.
On the Omni, as we keep working on confirming more judges and advancing the defense authorization bill, both sides also continue not negotiating a deal for a year-long omnibus. Over the weekend, appropriators held positive and productive conversations, enough that both sides are moving forward in good faith to reach a deal, even if it's not going to be everything both sides want. Later this week, members should be prepared to take quick action on a CR, a 1-week CR, so we can give appropriators more time to finish a full funding bill before the holidays. I'm optimistic we could take action on a CR rather quickly and avoid the shutdown that neither side wants, and that is a 1-week CR. The benefits of an omnibus are as many as the number of citizens in America. All of us are better off when the government is fully equipped to provide vital services millions rely on. One group who very much needs an omnibus are our veterans. Last week, the VA wrote Congress a letter warning that a CR would mean a $10 billion shortfall for the VA. That means fewer healthcare workers on the job. It would mean a surge in the backlog of claims. And God forbid it would throw a wrench in the VA's plan to implement something we were also proud that we passed on a bipartisan basis this summer, the PACT Act. There is no reason we need to go down this road. The brave Americans who have served our country in uniform should never have to suffer the consequences of failing to fund the government. But unfortunately, that's the risk they face as of right now if we don't finish the job. So to all my colleagues, let's continue negotiations in good faith. Both sides are going to have to give in order to get it done. But it'll be worth it if it means doing right by our veterans, our service members in uniforms, our kids, their families. That's what's at stake here in this process to fund the government.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer today on the floor. Senate Republican Leader Mitch McConnell also talked about the upcoming deadline and the Senate's consideration of the defense spending bill.
With less than 1 week remaining of government funding and less than 2 weeks left until our hard stop for the holidays on February the 23rd, That's the bad news, but the good news is that both sides have a clear understanding of what it takes to finish our work on a bipartisan basis. First, Senators Inhofe and Reid and their House counterparts have hashed out a strong bipartisan National Defense Authorization Act. The Senate should turn to it as soon as possible. But of course, Congress authorizes the tools, training, and equipment that our armed forces need will accomplish very little if we fail to then provide the actual funding. Both sides know what it would take for the Senate to pass a full-year government funding bill into law. There's no mystery here. A funding agreement would need to fully fund our national defense at the level written into the NDAA without lavishing extra funding beyond what President Biden even requested onto Democrats' partisan domestic priorities. In other words, to not go beyond what the president asked for earlier this year on the domestic side. Our Democratic colleagues have already spent 2 years massively increasing domestic spending using party line reconciliation bills outside the normal appropriations process. So clearly our colleagues cannot now demand even more domestic spending than President Biden even requested in exchange for funding the United States military. Funding our national defense is a basic governing duty. The Commander-in-Chief's own party does not get to demand a pile of unrelated goodies in exchange for doing their job and funding our armed forces. If House and Senate Democratic colleagues can accept these realities in the very near future, we may still have a shot at assembling a full-year funding bill that will give our military commanders the certainty they need to invest, plan, and stay competitive with rivals like China. If our Democratic colleagues can't accept those realities, the option will be a short-term bipartisan funding bill into early next year.
Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell today on the floor, and House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy has his own ideas about government funding. Here he is on Laura Ingram's show on Fox News on Friday.
But this omnibus thing takes away your power for 10 months. You will have no effect on these critical issues. Zero.
We're 28 days away from Republicans having the gavel. We would be stronger in every negotiation. So any Republican that's out there trying to work with them is wrong.
So that
Why
includes
wouldn't you
Mitch
wait
McConnell?
with the hand
Does
is
that
stronger?
include McConnell?
Yes. Why would you want to work on anything if we have the gavel inside Congress?
You just
we
won
have a
the
stronger.
House.
Yes. Wait till we're in charge.
And with the view from the White House, here's Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
I just wanted to get the White House's perspective on the current government funding talks. Schumer talked about doing a 1-week CR. Democrats were going to release their own legislation but held off. Does the White House see these as encouraging signs for being able to get a broad omnibus by the end of the month?
So look, we continue to encourage Congress to get a bipartisan deal done. We believe on the government funding, we believe there's still enough time to get that done. This is something that clearly Congress was able to do this time last year in a bipartisan way. But if they need extra days to get there, so be it. We got to remember, this is not a partisan issue. The issues that we are talking about, we talk about national security. We just had Jake Sullivan here, as I just noted a second ago. We talk about public education. We're talking about health care. These are, and veteran health services, to be even more specific. These are priorities for the American people. These are bipartisan issues that are critical to American individuals just across the country. So again, we encourage Congress to reach a bipartisan deal.
And with more on the negotiations, here's Max Cohen of Punchbowl News.
So Republicans traditionally have gone along with Democratic demands to pair the increase in defense funding with the increase in domestic social spending. This time around, Republicans are trying to break that parity. They don't want that continuing increase. They say Democrats had enough increases with the Inflation Reduction Act and other reconciliation programs. Democrats are still holding on that line. So there's still this disagreement. We expect there not to be a government shutdown, but it really depends whether there's a year-long omnibus or a year-long continuing resolution, which would be pretty impactful for the Pentagon and other departments. The government does not want that, but.
Let's set those two apart then. The differences between having an omnibus versus having a CR, and for those who may not follow as closely as you do, explain that.
Sure. So the omnibus would change the funding to however much negotiators agree to in this time period. The continuing resolution would kind of keep it steady at the fiscal year 2022 numbers. And Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has written to Congress saying if it's kept steady, we're not going to be able to combat some threats the United States faces. So Democrats are trying to say, look, the military says it's an issue. We need an omnibus to raise spending levels.
And then a congressional resolution or a CR, what would happen under that if it were extended for the course of a year or so?
Yeah, it would just kind of stay constant at the current levels of funding without an increase in funding that negotiators are trying to work out.
Several leaders had said leading up to this that they would introduce their own omnibus packages or their own versions. Where is that, and what's the concern about having a lot of different types of omnibus packages out there?
So Democrats were going to introduce theirs. Leahy has now said they're going to hold off. That's seen as a good sign for negotiations because when Democrats, Republicans start releasing their own frameworks, political messaging, they're trying to score points, say, here's our package, here's the Republicans' package. It's really not focusing on what they can agree on. But the fact that that has not been released is seen as good signs for the negotiation.
We've talked a lot about leadership. You said your publication covers leadership. Kevin McCarthy is still in a current effort to try to get people to his side to become House leader next year, or House Speaker next year. Where is that in the process, and what is he doing to get to there?
He's still a couple votes short of the 218 he needs to be elected House Speaker. We reported on a meeting he held late last week with members of the House Freedom Caucus and other far-right House members who are really holding back on support for McCarthy. He's trying to meet with these people. Matt Gaetz is among them. Andy Biggs is another opponent who's running for Speaker. And currently they're holding steadfast and saying they're a hard no on Kevin McCarthy. The House Freedom Caucus, in this instance, some members, I think, oppose McCarthy, and just for a reason which he's been leader, and they say he represents the establishment. And that's going to be pretty difficult, in my opinion, for McCarthy to overcome, because there are some policy disagreements over rules, how Congress works. They want it easier to remove the House Speaker at times. But a lot of it, I think, is sometimes personal distrust and dislike of McCarthy himself, and that's hard to change.
Is there a sense of what concessions he's making to these various people that he's talking to in order to gain their support?
From our reporting, he's going to have to make some pretty major rules concessions. One instance is the motion to vacate the chair, which is a mechanism used by the Freedom Caucus during Speaker Boehner's term, which honestly lessens the power of leadership. And that's something McCarthy came into this process having a pretty hard line on. He doesn't want his power to be yanked away at a moment's notice like these members are proposing, but I think he'll probably have to move on that to make it easier for that mechanism to happen if he wants their support.
One of the things Representative Jim Comer has an op-ed out in the Wall Street Journal today. He's set to become the chair of the Oversight Committee, and investigation seems to be one of the things that they will focus on in the next Congress. What is the plan from Republican leadership to focus on investigations, but also make legislative efforts as well?
When you have divided government, Republicans controlling the House, Democrats in the Senate, Oversight's always going to take center stage because there's always going to be little agreement between Republicans in the House, Democrats in the Senate over large bills. So Oversight naturally is going to take a front seat, but Republicans have to be wary of their thin majority. A lot of members flip blue seats in places like New York, Long Island, and they've kind of come out publicly and said, we don't want this just to be about Hunter Biden, about the border, about Afghanistan. We want to focus on inflation. The issue with that is it's very unlikely you see agreement across the houses with stuff like inflation or other large legislation. So investigations will be front and center. Whether some swing district Republicans like that or not is beside the point.
I was going to say, what was your sense as far as the Republican conference overall and such a focus on investigation? Where are they on that?
Well, I've spoken to incoming chairman Jim Comer about this, and he said, look, the Oversight Committee is 8% of our conference. It's going to take up, in my opinion, the majority of the airtime, but he's saying this is our job as the Oversight Committee. And Republicans also say we campaigned on oversight. They said voters want to check on the Biden administration. They want to look into COVID funding, origins of COVID, the Afghanistan withdrawal. And the first press conference Comer and incoming Judiciary Chair Jim Jordan held was on the Biden family and Biden family business dealings. So they've been very upfront about it. That's going to be a major focus, and they say this is what their base voters want.
Punchbowl News congressional reporter Max Cohen on today's Washington Journal. You can see the whole segment at cspan.org/Washington Journal and on our C-SPAN Now video app. And we heard Max Cohen mention Kentucky Republican James Comer, who is slated to be the new chair of the House Oversight Committee. Here is Representative Comer earlier today talking about his priorities.
Based on what I'm reading, you're going to be like the busiest man in America come the new year. You wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal. The headline is this: "Get ready for Republican oversight. The House committee I'm slated to head will conduct serious investigations and propose real reforms." And here's your list: border and fentanyl crises, pandemic relief fraud, Afghanistan withdrawal, energy crisis, COVID origins, Biden's family business schemes. How are you going to get all that done?
Well, I'm fortunate to have a large staff. Our staff will essentially double on January 3rd when we go from the minority to the majority. I've got some great members on the committee. We've got some new ones coming in that are really interested in oversight. And if you think about it, there has been zero oversight in this building for the past 2 years. The Democrats have had the majority in both the House and the Senate, and they've completely turned a blind eye to the Biden administration, to their disastrous policies, to their runaway spending, and to the elephant in the room, this influence peddling that their family continues to do.
And I noticed in your op-ed that you wrote over the weekend with the headline, get ready for Republican oversight. One of the things that you stressed is that every one of these hearings has to be tied to something about the national interest. And you know already that there's a huge amount of effort from the Democrats, even outside of politics and from these outside groups, a lot of money to try to discredit you before you even get going, and to suggest that this isn't what the public wants, that the public wants Republicans and Democrats to work together to solve problems. How do you plan to combat that communications effort by the Democrats?
Well, they've already spent millions of dollars attacking Kevin McCarthy, Jim Jordan, and myself. We're just paying no attention to those attacks. We're focused ahead. We're basing our evidence and our investigation. We're basing our investigations on evidence. Everything that we've brought forward, we have reason to believe is necessary from an investigative or an oversight standpoint. This administration refuses to cooperate with any type of investigations, with any type of oversight. And the hypocrisy for Joe Biden and the Democrats to say, well, the American people don't want any investigations. They want Republicans and Democrats to get along. Name one time over the past 2 years Joe Biden's tried to do anything to be somewhat bipartisan.
Kentucky Republican James Comer earlier today on Fox News. You're listening to Washington Today.
Live Tuesday on C-SPAN Radio at 10 a.m. Eastern. Sam Bankman-Fried, former CEO of FTX, the global cryptocurrency trading platform, and current CEO John Ray III testify about the recent collapse of that company. House Financial Services Committee holds this hearing about the FTX bankruptcy. Live Tuesday, 10 a.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio.
Welcome back to Washington Today. Here are some more headlines. A Libyan intelligence official appeared in federal court for the first time today to face charges that he made the bomb that brought down Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988. The appearance follows the Justice Department's announcement yesterday that Abu Aguila Mohammed Masoud Kir al-Amiri had been taken into U.S. custody 2 years after first being charged. 2 other Libyan intelligence officials have also been charged in the U.S. for their alleged involvement in the attack, but Masoud is the first to face prosecution in the U.S. The New York-bound Pan Am flight exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, less than an hour after takeoff from London on December 21st, 1988. 259 people in the air and 11 on the ground were killed. Among the 190 Americans on board were 35 Syracuse University students flying home for Christmas after a semester abroad. More Americans are moving into regions where climate change is making wildfires and extreme heat more common. That's according to a new study done at the University of Vermont. Americans are moving to cities and suburbs in the Pacific Northwest, parts of the Southwest, Texas, Florida, and parts of the Southeast, according to the study. The study's lead author, Mahala Clark, told CNBC, Quote, "We hope our study will increase people's awareness of wildfire and other climate risks when moving or buying a house, since many people might be unaware of these dangers. People tend to think of wildfire as something that affects the West, but it also affects large areas of the South and even Midwest." The city of Richmond, Virginia, has removed its last public Confederate monument. The statue of Confederate General A.P. Hill sits in the middle of a busy intersection where traffic accidents are frequent, and removing it was complicated because the general's remains are interred beneath it. But the statue was finally freed from its base Monday morning and placed onto a flatbed truck. It will be given to the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia. President Biden is hosting 49 African national leaders in Washington this week for a 3-day meeting that begins tomorrow. And the AP reporting that the White House is going into the meeting, quote, looking to narrow a gaping trust gap with America's commitment to the continent. Talks are expected to center on the coronavirus, climate change, the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on Africa, and trade. It will be the biggest international gathering in Washington since before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And with more, here's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan.
As you know, the president intends to announce U.S. support for the African Union to join the G20 as a permanent member. It's past time for Africa to have permanent seats at the table in international organizations and initiatives, and the president also plans to underscore his commitment to UN Security Council reform, including support for a permanent member from the African continent. Working closely with Congress, the U.S. will commit $55 billion to Africa over the course of the next 3 years, across a wide range of sectors to tackle the core challenges of our time. These commitments build on the United States' long-standing leadership and partnership in development, economic growth, health, and security in Africa over the past 3 decades. You'll be hearing a number of announcements over the coming days, specific deliverables in a number of different areas, new projects and initiatives, new funding streams, but our commitment to Africa extends well beyond all of that too. It's reflected in our decades of meaningful engagement, people-to-people ties, and high-quality investments in our shared future. And really, the spirit of this summit is not what we will do for African nations and peoples, but what we will do with African nations and peoples.
Jake Sullivan was also asked today about the comments of freed Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout, who said on Saturday that he, quote, wholeheartedly supports the Russian invasion of Ukraine and that he would volunteer to fight in the battle. Viktor Bout was released on Thursday from an American jail in a prisoner swap for WNBA and Olympic basketball star Brittany Griner.
Can I just ask real quick? Viktor Bout has said that he wants to be involved with the Russian Federation's efforts against Ukraine. Is the administration planning to respond should he do something like that? Whether either tied to weapons or his political activities, anything like that?
From our perspective, what we want to do is make sure that we are blunting any Russian effort to be able to gain advantage in Ukraine, whether it's military advantage or advantage through brutalizing and destroying civilian infrastructure. So our focus is going to be upon those things that actually represent a genuine threat to Ukraine and the people of Ukraine, not to comments that are made on television shows. And we'll continue to focus on that as we go forward. And for example, just last Friday, we announced another $275 million in military support to Ukraine. We will have further announcements in the coming days. So we're going to look at what's actually happening in the air and on the ground in Ukraine, not so much as what's happening on the other air on television stations in Russia.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan earlier today at the White House. Last week, Congress passed a marriage equality bill that protects same-sex and interracial marriage under federal law. And today, one of the lead Senate negotiators, Maine Republican Susan Collins, talked about the deal that helped get the bill passed.
Senator Collins, there are many Republicans who said that same-sex marriage is not in jeopardy, and so perhaps this wasn't even necessary. So can you talk about why you got involved in these negotiations and these discussions?
Well, like most people, I know same-sex couples. They are our family members, our friends, our coworkers, our neighbors. And I started hearing from them a real sense of concern that there was now a cloud over their marriages. They wondered how it would affect visitation rights at a hospital, inheritance rights, if they have children, whether it would affect their parental rights. I can't tell you how many same-sex couples have come up to me since we got this bill passed, literally with tears in their eyes, saying that I, through my work with Tammy and the wonderful coalition that we had lifted a burden from them. So that's who I first heard from. It was constituents, it was friends, it was coworkers who felt that their marriages were at risk of being no longer valid.
Senator Collins, did you think there was going to be an uphill battle in trying to pass this legislation?
Well, I knew it wouldn't be easy, and it certainly was anything but easy. But I was very encouraged when the House passed by more than 40 votes originally, the Respect for Marriage Act. And in talking with my Republican colleagues and with Tammy, I felt that if we could come up with some language that made it clear that we were not in any way weakening religious liberties and that we respected people who had views that were different from mine, for example, on same-sex marriages, that we could, in fact, get the bill over the finish line. And we had a wonderful group in the Senate. Senator Baldwin was our leader, Senator Tillis, Senator Portman, Senator Sinema, and I, who really worked extremely hard to persuade our colleagues on both sides of the aisle that we could advance both religious liberty and the rights of the LGBTQ community. And we did.
Maine Republican Senator Susan Collins speaking with the Washington Post Live anchor Leanne Caldwell. The Senate passed the marriage equality bill on November 29th. The House passed it on December 9th. Both votes were bipartisan, and the White House announced today that the president will sign the bill at a ceremony tomorrow. Finally, today, President Biden and First Lady Dr. Jill Biden helped pack presents as the White House marked the 75th anniversary of Toys for Tots. The event took place at Joint Base Meyer-Henderson Hall in Arlington, Virginia, and is part of the First Lady's Joining Forces initiative.
Toys for Tots is one of the best events of the year at the White House. We set up donation boxes everywhere. And last week, one of the collection boxes in the Eisenhower building had things, huge thing, stuffed animals, smiling, toy bunny, perched on the edge. You can't see something like that without smiling. And that's what you all do. For 75 years, you brought joy and laughter and smiles to families all across this country. Last year alone, you collected 22 million toys for more than 8 million children, giving Santa a run for his money. But unlike Santa, you don't wear big red suits. You don't travel the world in just one night. Instead, you wear dress blues and army greens, and as Marines, soldiers, sailors, you stand watch around the world every single night. As Jill mentioned, we have a We the Children's Room at the White House. And one of the pieces of this year's broader holiday theme is We the People when you come to the White House. Those are the very first words of our Constitution, I say to all the adults. They're the very idea of America. And in We the People, we see you and the best of us. The women and men who gave everything to our country and give back to our communities. You aren't just heart and soul of our nation, you're the very spine of our nation. And we owe you. In We the People, we also see all the spouses, partners, and children here today. Jill and I know how much you give to our nation and how much you sacrifice. The English poet John Milton once wrote, "They also serve who only stand and wait." And it's true. We know that for those of you with husbands, wives, moms, dads, friends, loved ones deployed overseas, it can be extra tough this time of year.
There are more than 800 local Toys for Tots campaigns in all 50 states, D.C., Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Virgin Islands. A reminder, you can find this program as a podcast at cspan.org/podcast. It's also on our C-SPAN Now mobile app, wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like more on the stories that are shaping Washington, you can subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter, word for word. Just go to cspan.org/connect to subscribe. I'm Gary Sterkoff. Thanks a lot for listening today to Washington Today.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Every day we're taking your calls live, on the air, on the news of the day, and we'll discuss policy issues that impact you. Coming up Tuesday morning, Ben Olinsky with the Center for American Progress discusses allegations of Supreme Court leaks and the broader effort to establish a code of ethics for Supreme Court justices. Then Texas Republican Congressman August Pfluger, a member of the Foreign Affairs and Homeland Security Committees, talks about the government funding bill, border security, and other priorities for the 118th Congress. Also, Bloomberg government reporter Alex Ruoff discusses the final report of the House Select Subcommittee on the coronavirus crisis and its recommendations going forward. Watch Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Tuesday morning on C-SPAN or on C-SPAN Now, our free mobile video app. Join the discussion with your phone calls, Facebook comments, text messages, and tweets.